Greetings, this is Griff Ruby, the Nostalgic Catholic, with yet another Isaac Asimov short story. This one is featured in the January 1955 issue of the magazine of fantasy and science fiction, and at least his name is on the cover, though nothing regarding the story. The artwork pertains to a different story, namely The Tournament by William Sansom. Okay. However, he's in here. It simply says, The Singing Bell by Isaac Asimov, page 97. Okay. Now, let's go to page 97. There is a blurb there, which of course does not get reprinted anywhere, so I'll read this blurb in full. And it says, okay, many of us have experimented with blends of science fiction and the detective story, but none more successfully than Isaac Asimov, especially in that almost perfect fusion, The Caves of Steel, Doubleday, 1954. Now, in the first of a series of stories for fantasy and science fiction, Mr. Asimov, still Mr., not Doctor, tries something new, an inverted detective story of the future. That's kind of futuristic, actually. You see what I mean. Modeled upon those revolutionary detective exploits of Dr. Thorndyke's, which R. Austin Freeman, I don't think that R is for robot, like R. Daniel Olival, R. Austin Freeman published as The Singing Bone, Hodder and Slotin, 1912, that Freeman himself described the singular method of these stories. The first part was a minute and detailed description of a crime. The reader had seen the crime committed, knew all about the criminal, and was in possession of all the facts. It would have seemed that there was nothing left to tell. But the second part, which described the investigation of the crime, had to most readers the effect of new matter. All the facts were known, but their evidential quality had not been recognized. Mr. Asimov's essay in Reader Bafflement is, in its way, even trickier than those of Mr. Freeman, for he makes his puzzle hinge on a clue which can occur only in the future, yet which can be interpreted by any reader on the basis of today's knowledge. I'm happy to introduce you to Dr. Wendell Urth, extraterritorialist and detective in his first recorded case. Good luck in matching wits with them. So, there's no artwork associated with the story. It's just the blurb, and then we dive The Singing Bell by Isaac Asimov. And from here, the text is, in most regards, almost identical to the text as it appears in Asimov's Mysteries. So, but I say almost, because there's a few small things. There's some minor punctuation differences. You might get ... in the original. It was a dash in the book. It is the two parts, which is kind of interesting, that this form of telling the whole crime first and then how the detective can figure it out. You know, I mean, we know in our own lifetime, my own lifetime, Columbo made that very, very famous. But this really hadn't been seen since 1912, apparently, except in this one little short story here. I'm not sure that even shows up in the other Wendell Urth stories. So, between the two parts, in the books they have a little row of a few stars in the middle of the page. In the original, it actually says Part 2. Big deal. There's a couple other slightly bigger changes. One reflects further knowledge about space, and the other one is caused by the well, I don't know what the other one is actually caused by. So let's see if I can find this here. Yeah. Oh boy. Extraterritorialist. Okay, so, well, there was one where he's kind of wandering through the house of this, here we go, page 105. He's wandering through the house of Wendell Urth, and he finds a few odds and ends. A small lump of blue glaze from Mars, the sort of thing some romantics consider to be an artifact of long-extinct Martians, a small meteorite, a model of an early spaceship, and then this is the really interesting one, a sealed bottle of liquid, scrawlingly labeled Venusian Ocean. Well, obviously by 1969, when these stories were being gathered into here, we know that that's not what Venusian oceans. There aren't any oceans on Venus, and so we now have to say a sealed bottle of nothing, scrawlingly labeled Venusian atmosphere. Okay, there's another symbol change. There's a couple paragraphs later on. A few paragraphs. And that is that okay. Let's see here. It pushes aside a chart showing the evolutionary scheme of the development of marine invertebrates that were the highest life forms on, originally says Arcturus V, or 5. And on here, that becomes, instead of Arcturus V, it becomes the highest life forms on Barnard's planet. And say, okay, Barnard's planet. I've heard Barnard's star. It's kind of unusual because it has a motion that's so lateral to ours that you could actually see it moving across the sky. You know, if you go compare recent pictures of a particular night sky where that part of the star is seen from so many years ago, and now you can actually see it move discernibly. It moves across the sky from the perspective of Earth faster than any other star in the sky. So, but that's Barnard's star, and presumably Barnard's planet would be some planet around that star. Okay. So, a few minor textual variations, but other than that, they are the same story. And it's a kind of an interesting story. Singing Bell. Apparently, in the story, the strange formation turns up on the moon, and somebody had found about a dozen of them, and every one of them are very, very rare and very extraordinary. It's this kind of hollow glassite thing made out of some sort of hardened pumice that kind of came together and somehow has the structural rigidity to hold a vacuum even in the atmosphere of Earth, and don't drop it, you'll break it. But very delicate things. But you can hit them and they ring like this bell that just sounds absolutely awesome. And there's little particles and you can hear those move around in there when you and so forth that just kind of occur naturally. So there's these singing bells, and the idea is these things are worth a lot of money. We're talking a good singing bell is worth $100,000, and that's $100,000 in 1954 or 5 currency. So you could just kind of expand that with inflation till now, and you're talking a consequential sum of money here. Okay. That said, somebody has conspired to steal those singing bells. 2 guys actually, and then one murders the other. There's our murder mystery. We have the whole crime spelled out in detail, and then it's up to Wendell Urth to figure out how to prove that the guy had done it. And what's kind of clever is he doesn't have an alibi, because if you had an alibi, you'd pick it apart until it breaks down. So if you don't have an alibi, that's where stuff gets kind of fun and interesting. Well, I wasn't planning anything. I mean, if I was going to plan something, I'd make sure I had an alibi. So it's kind of an inverse thing. It's safer not to have an alibi. Sorry, I was at home alone. I watched TV a while, and I went to bed. I mean, nobody was at home with me. So I can't prove I was there. I mean, it wasn't like I was out to make sure I had an alibi. So they guys said, well, how do we know you didn't sneak out of your house and do this and that? But that's not good enough here. There's even mention of a psychoprobe. that turns up in a lot of places. You see it in the Foundation stories, you see it in the Galactic Era novels, and even other short stories. And I think even, I don't know if maybe even some robot stories. It's or other stories. The Psychic Probe is kind of all over the place, and it's in this story too. This also has the distinction of being the first of, as it turns out, only 4 Wendell Urth stories. So, this story, being what it is, Wendell Urth, without leaving his apartment, he's an interesting character too. I mean, I've already described a little bit of the bric-a-brac in his house. He's a bachelor, so he just has all kinds of crazy stuff in his house. He describes it as kind of like a museum of sorts of some of these rare and exotic artifacts from different parts of the, I don't know, these different planets and so forth. But he himself has a lot in common with Asimov. Asimov seldom traveled very far. It was a big deal for him just to make it to Chicago one time. He had done some things as a younger guy when he was in uniform. They had to send him, at least as far as Hawaii or something on the way towards. They were going to have him witness the nuclear blast, and then some exceptional thing, and he wasn't there, and he may have gotten an extension of life because he might have been irradiated otherwise. So, but in his older life, he lived in Boston or he lived in New York, or and that's it. Although he wasn't afraid of public transportation, Wendell Urth takes it one step further. He's afraid of every form of transportation except walking around himself. So if it isn't within walking distance, he hasn't been there. Yet he studies extraterrestrial life forms and other things pertaining to other planets. He said, well, you don't have to go to the planets to study these things. I mean, you don't have to go into a time machine to be a historian. But you might want to go to the local sites where digs could take place where you could discover evidence and artifacts of historical events and persons. So, but I'll leave that out. So, the character of Wendell Urth, U-R-T-H, but it sounds like a planet Earth kind of, I don't know, I think there's a fun in that. It's intentional. Wendell Urth is this rather curious little guy with a flat nose and glasses that are ever in danger of falling off of it because it is so stub-nosed. Kind of a short, fat little guy. Very sedentary, as you can see. But he's got a very brilliant mind. And so he's able to figure out a way. He has to have the person brought to his house, basically. But he's able to figure it out, and, well, I will leave that detail to the reading of the story. I'd rather not spoil it. But suffice to say, just as Columbo gets his man, so does Wendell Urth. And enough evidence to justify using the psychic probe, because apparently, and they discuss it in the story, there's a lot to using the psychic probe. You can only do it once in a person's lifetime to that person, ever, for any reason. That's kind of an extreme law, but okay, that's one of the parameters we set for the story. And while the main criminal had that, we also know that if he had, we'd find out all kinds of stuff that he'd rather people didn't know, or at least not till after he's gone. So, but if you can get enough evidence, because if you don't, and the evidence isn't good enough, they might not psychoprobe, because you don't want to risk what happens if you psychoprobe and it turns out the person really wasn't guilty of the crime. They can sue you. So you don't want to do a psychoprobe without very strong evidence that the person really did the crime. So that's kind of the strictures under which Wendell Urth had to operate. Anyway, he succeeds at that, and the proof is good enough. The psychic probe finishes it. And Wendell Urth, who happens to own a somewhat flawed singing bell, manages to gain a brand new singing bell out of the whole thing as a transaction. So, that's the story, and like I said, I myself am rather fond of the Wendell Urth stories, and it's kind of a pity that only 4 of them exist. Alright, thank you for listening.